The silence in the royal bedchamber was heavier than the stone walls that enclosed it. It was a silence built on the echo of shattered doors and snapped bones, dragged all the way from the council wing and sealed inside this opulent room. I lay flat on my back on the sprawling expanse of the silken mattress, my breath trapped in a chest that felt too small for my racing heart. Above me, he hovered. Atlas. But it wasn't the king who had thrown me in here weeks ago. It wasn't even the man who had taken an arrow for me. This was the creature that lived inside the curse, the primal, unchecked force that had just obliterated a high councilman in a spray of gore. His clothes, fine black leather and silk, were shredded across his impossibly broad chest and shoulders, burst seams hanging loose where muscles had swelled beyond human proportion. Blood, Seth's blood, dark and viscous, slicked his forearms and stained the ragged edges of his tunic. But it was his eyes that pinned me to the bed. They were no longer molten gold. They were glowing pools of crimson, a vibrant, terrifying red that held no recognition, only a bottomless, ancient hunger. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The sounds escaping his throat were low, vibrating growls that seemed to emanate from the center of the earth, rattling the very frame of the heavy bed. My body trembled, a leaf in a hurricane. The bond between us, which had been numb for days, was now a chaotic, deafening storm. I felt his residual rage, hot and blinding, but beneath it, something else was rising, something volcanic. He lowered himself slowly, the movement predatory and precise. His massive frame caged me in, his knees bracketing my hips, his hands, fingers tipped with sharp, curved claws, planting themselves on the pillows on either side of my head. The scent of him was overwhelming. Iron and copper from the blood, mixed with the rich, dark musk of an aroused, enraged alpha. It filled my nose, my lungs, dizzying me. It was the scent of violence, but God help me, it didn't make me recoil. It made something deep in my own blood, something I hadn't known existed until this moment. Sing in answer. He lowered his head until his face was inches from mine. The heat radiating from his skin was like a furnace door standing ajar. He inhaled, a long, shuddering intake of breath along the column of my throat. The wet warmth of his nose brushed against my pulse point, which was hammering a frantic rhythm against my skin. The growl in his chest deepened, vibrating through the mattress and into my own bones. Mine, he grated out. The word wasn't spoken. It was torn from a throat not currently shaped for human speech. It was a guttural assertion of ownership that brooked no argument from God or man. He needed to erase the stain of treason. He needed to wash away the scent of death that clung to him, and the only thing powerful enough to do that was life. Was me. He didn't move with the cold precision of the king. He moved with the desperate urgency of a starving beast. One clawed hand moved from the pillow to the neckline of the stolen servant's dress I still wore. There was no hesitation, no fumbling with buttons. With a sharp, violent rending sound, he tore the coarse fabric from neck to waist. I gasped as the cool air hit my skin, followed instantly by the searing heat of his gaze devouring me. The crimson of his eyes seemed to pulse brighter as he looked at my bare breasts, rising and falling rapidly with my shallow breaths. He didn't touch me yet. He just looked, his chest heaving, fighting a war between the urge to crush and the need to cherish. The air between us crackled, thick with unspent energy. Then he lowered his head again. His mouth, hot and wet, pressed against the swell of my breast. He didn't kiss. He tasted. He licked a broad stripe up to my collarbone, his tongue rough like a cat's, rasping against my sensitive skin. The sensation sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to my core, causing my hips to buck instinctively upward. That small movement snapped his tenuous control. A roar ripped from his throat, shaking the canopy above us. He shifted, his heavy thigh pressing between my legs, parting them with an insistence that made my breath catch. His clawed hand moved down my stomach, not gently, leaving trails of heat in its wake. He hooked his fingers into the waistband of my underthings and ripped them away in one savage motion. I was completely bare beneath him, exposed to the monster. "Atlas!" I whimpered, the sound pathetic in the charged air. I didn't know if I was begging him to stop or pleading with him to never stop. He ignored my voice. He was listening only to the blood rushing in my veins, the scent of my arousal mixing with my fear. He reared back, sitting up on his knees between my legs. His hands went to the shredded remains of his breeches, shoving them down with frantic haste. My eyes widened. He was enormous, terrifyingly so, thick and dusky and pulsing with the same raw, violent energy that radiated from the rest of him. A fresh wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know how that could possibly fit. He saw the fear in my eyes. The crimson softened, just a fraction, swirling with gold for the briefest second. The bond hummed with a sudden fierce protectiveness. "Won't break you," the voice in my head whispered. Deep, distorted, but undeniably him. "Never break what is mine." He leaned forward, bracing his weight on one arm, his other hand moving between my legs. His touch was shocking, hot, calloused, and incredibly large. He didn't tease. He hated teasing. He needed to know. He pushed 2 fingers inside me. My body went rigid, a choked cry escaping my lips at the sudden slick intrusion. It felt impossibly tight, a stretching burn that was foreign and overwhelming. Atlas went still. His entire massive body froze above me. The crimson eyes flared wide, the pupils blowing out until there was almost no iris left. He withdrew his fingers slowly, bringing them to his face. He inhaled deeply, scenting the slickness on his skin. The realization hit him like a physical blow, crashing through the bond between us with staggering force. Untouched. The thought was a roar in his mind, a possessive triumph that drowned out everything else. I was his, not just by decree, not just by the bond, but wholly and completely. No other male had ever looked at me like this, touched me like this. The knowledge shattered whatever restraint he had left. The growl that tore from him then was deafening, a sound of pure, unadulterated alpha dominance. "Only me," he snarled, his voice thick with a terrifying mix of reverence and rage. "Forever only me." He didn't prepare me further. He couldn't wait another second. He grabbed my hips, his claws digging into the soft flesh, anchoring me to the mattress. He positioned himself at my entrance, the blunt head of him pressing against sanity. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself, my hands flying up to grip his shoulders. His skin was scorching hot, the muscles beneath steel hard and vibrating with tension. He pushed forward. It was a slow, agonizing invasion. I cried out, a high, thin sound, as my body stretched beyond what I thought possible to accommodate him. It burned, a sharp, stinging fire that felt like I was being torn apart. "Look at me, Stella." The command was harsh, guttural. I forced my eyes open. His face was inches from mine, sweat beading on his brow, his jaw clenched so tight I thought the bone might snap. The crimson in his eyes was swirling chaotically with molten gold. He was fighting his own strength, holding back the tidal wave of his power so he didn't split me in two. "Breathe," he growled. I tried, gasping raggedly. He pushed again, harder this time, breaking past the barrier of my innocence. A sharp cry tore from my throat, tears stinging my eyes at the sudden exquisite pain. He stopped, buried deep inside me. He went completely still, his breath escaping in harsh pants against my damp forehead. The bond was flooded with his overwhelming sensation, the tight, hot velvet of me surrounding him, the sheer mind-numbing pleasure of finally being seated within his mate. He lowered his forehead to rest against mine, his massive shoulders shaking. "Mine," he whispered, the word trembling. "You are mine." He began to move. At first, it was slow, long, deep strokes that felt like he was rearranging my insides, branding every inch of me with his presence. The burn began to fade, replaced by a heavy, throbbing friction that sent sparks dancing along my nerves. My hands moved from his shoulders to his back, my fingers digging into the scarred ridges of muscle as the rhythm picked up. He wasn't gentle. He couldn't be. He was a creature of violence and power, and he loved with the same ferocity. Every thrust was a claim, a punishing squeeze that forced soft gasps from my lips. The bed frame slammed against the stone wall with a rhythmic thud that echoed through the room. His growls deepened, syncing with his movements. The sensation built rapidly, a coiling heat low in my belly that tightened with every stroke. It was too much, too big, too intense, too overwhelming. I was drowning in him, in his scent, in the crushing weight of his body and the undeniable pull of the bond. Atlas, I breathed, my head thrashing on the pillows. Please. He knew what I needed before I did. The bond was a live wire between us, transmitting every spike in my arousal directly to him. Let go, little bird, he growled against my ear, his teeth grazing the lobe. Give it to me. He hooked my legs over his shoulders, opening me completely to him, driving deeper, faster. The pleasure turned sharp, blinding. My vision went white at the edges. I was climbing a cliff edge, higher and higher, the air thinning, my body winding tighter than a coiled spring. I felt him tense, his entire body going rigid above me as he approached his own edge. The climax hit me like a physical blow. I screamed, my back arching off the mattress, my inner muscles clamping down around him in violent spasms. Waves of pure, undiluted ecstasy crashed over me, shattering me into a million pieces of light and sound. At the very apex of my release, just as I thought I might die from the sheer intensity of it, Atlas roared. It was a sound of ultimate possession. He yanked me upward, crushing my chest to his. His head snapped down to the junction of my neck and shoulder. I felt the sharp, hot prick of teeth against the sensitive skin over my mating gland. Then, he bit down. His fangs sank deep into my flesh. The pain was shocking, exquisite, merging instantly with the throes of my climax. It wasn't just a physical bite. It was a psychic branding. The bond between us, which had been a raw, exploded. It was blinding white light inside my mind. The walls slammed down. I wasn't just feeling his emotions anymore. I was drowning in his soul. His ancient loneliness, his paralyzing fear of the curse, his boundless rage, and beneath it all, a love for me so terrifyingly vast, it felt like it could swallow the world whole. He poured himself into me, body and soul, shuddering violently as he emptied his seed deep inside my womb. He held the bite as the waves of pleasure subsided, his growls vibrating against my throat, his tongue lapping at the blood that welled around the puncture marks. He had claimed me in blood and flesh. I was no longer just tethered to the ruthless king. I was part of him. And as I lay there, gasping for air beneath the crushing, wonderful weight of my mate, the crimson faded slowly from his eyes, leaving behind pools of exhausted molten gold that looked down at me with a worshipful terror. And as I lay there, gasping for air beneath the crushing, wonderful weight of my mate, the crimson faded slowly from his eyes, leaving behind pools of exhausted molten gold.
Consciousness returned not like a sunrise, but like a violently thrown stone shattering the surface of a frozen lake. I woke instantly, my whole body tensed for a threat that wasn't there. The beast, sated but still prowling just beneath my skin, huffed in recognition of our surroundings. My chambers, my bed, and her. Stella was curled against my side, a small, dull shape, almost swallowed by the vastness of the dark silk sheets. She was sleeping heavily, the deep, restorative sleep of total exhaustion. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a sensory overload that was entirely new. Before the claiming, the bond had been a golden chain, sometimes slack, sometimes yanking hard enough to choke me. Now, the chain was gone. It had melted down and reforged itself into a live wire running directly from my soul to hers. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information flooding my mind. I could feel the slow, steady thrum of her heart, as if it were beating in my own chest. I felt the phantom ache in her muscles, a soreness in her thighs, a tenderness between her legs, that mirrored the satisfying, heavy ache in my own body. But beneath the physical, there was something else, an emotional current that terrified me with its clarity. There was no fear. After what I had done, after the violence, the shredding of clothes, the animalistic taking of her innocence, she wasn't afraid. Deep in the quiet center of her sleep, there was a profound, settling sense of belonging. It made my throat tighten to the point of pain. She should hate me. She should be cowering on the far side of the bed. Yet here she was, pressed against the furnace of my body as if I were a sanctuary instead of the monster that had broken her. I shifted carefully, propping myself up on an elbow to look down at her. The morning light, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, painted stripes across her skin. My breath hitched. She looked like a battlefield victim. Bruises were already blooming on her hips, where my claws had gripped her too tightly. Her lips were swollen, bitten red. And then there was the mark, my gaze fixed on the junction of her neck and shoulder. The skin around her mating gland was angry and inflamed, swollen tight around 4 distinct puncture wounds. My mark, permanent, irrevocable. A surge of possessiveness so violent it made my vision swim washed over me. The beast purred, a deep tectonic rumble in my chest that I quickly suppressed, afraid to wake her. Mine. The word echoed in my skull, a relentless drumbeat. I reached out, my large hand hovering over the bite. I wanted to touch it, to trace the evidence of my ownership. But I remembered the crimson haze of last night, the lack of control. My hand was shaking. I was afraid I'd hurt her again just by touching her. I pulled my hand back, a growl of self-loathing catching in my throat. I was a king who could snap a man's spine with one hand, yet I was terrified of brushing against my own mate's skin. A sharp rap on the outer chamber door shattered the quiet moment. The intrusion was like ice water dumped over my head. Reality crashed back in. Seth. The treason. The blood on the carpet in the council wing. The shift in me was instantaneous. The tender, terrified mate vanished, replaced by the ruthless king. My armor. The cold, impenetrable facade that had kept me alive for 34 years, slammed back into place. I slipped out of bed, the movement silent despite my size. Leaving her warmth was a physical wrench, a tearing sensation in my chest, but necessity was a colder master. I took a quick shower, dressed quickly in fresh leathers, buckling my sword belt tight. I caught a glimpse of myself in the polished bronze mirror. My eyes were hard, golden flint. My jaw was set. The monster was locked away, but the man who remained was just as dangerous. I crossed to the door, pausing with my hand on the latch. I looked back at the bed one last time. Stay. The impulse to crawl back in, to barricade the door and let the world burn while I held her, was agonizing. I crushed it. I had to make the world safe for her first. I opened the door and stepped into the corridor. Greg was waiting, his face pale and drawn. He looked at me. Then his eyes darted to the closed bedroom door, and I saw the question in them. He smelled the change on me, the rich, undeniable scent of a completed mating. He said nothing about it. He knew better. Report, I commanded, my voice a shard of ice, devoid of the emotion churning inside me. We walked toward the council wing. The palace was deathly silent. Word had spread. They knew the king had broken his leash. We've sealed the corridor, Greg said, keeping pace with my long strides. Seth's body has been removed. The archivists are already trying to salvage what they can from his office. Burn it, I said flatly. Greg stumbled slightly. Sire, the records? Burn the office, burn everything in it, brick up the doorway. I stopped, turning to face him. My aura flared, heavy and suffocating, making the guards further down the hall flinch. I want no trace of the traitor left within these walls. His name is stricken from the histories. His family's lands are seas, his kin exiled to the northern wastes by sundown tomorrow. Greg swallowed hard, nodding. It shall be done, Alpha. And the borders, I continued, resuming my stalking pace. Vane knows his inside man is dead by now. He will either retreat or strike out of desperation. Double the patrols. If a squirrel crosses into my territory from the south, I want it skinned. I spent the next 4 hours in the war room, dismantling the damage Seth had done. I was brutal. I was efficient. I was the terrifying, emotionless monolith they all expected me to be. I issued decrees that would cripple Vane's trade routes and set bounties on his known associates that would make them turn on each other. But every second I sat in that cold stone chair, a different kind of war was raging inside me. The bond was a constant, nagging tug in the center of my chest. I could feel Stella waking up. I felt her confusion, followed quickly by a wave of soreness that made me grip the arms of my chair until the wood groaned. I needed to go back. The need was a physical itch under my skin, a desperate craving that made it hard to focus on grain tariffs and troop movements. "Greg, finish this," I snapped, in the middle of a sentence about supply lines. I stood up abruptly, the heavy chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. Before my beta could acknowledge the order, I was out the door. I didn't walk back to my chambers. I hunted my way back. I moved through the corridors with a singular focus, ignoring the bowing servants. When I opened the door to our room, the scent hit me. Rain, wildflowers, and sex. It was intoxicating. It smelled like home. Stella was sitting up in bed, the silk sheet pulled up to her chin. Her hair was a chaotic halo around her dull face. Her eyes found mine instantly. There was a flicker of uncertainty there, a question. Who was walking through that door? The beast who had ravaged her, or the king who ignored her? I closed the door and threw the bolt, locking the world out. The ice melted. The ruthless king dissolved the moment I was alone with her. I crossed the room to the bed. I didn't stop until my knees hit the mattress. I needed to touch her. It wasn't a want. It was a biological imperative, as vital as breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed. Up close, the bruises on her arms looked darker against the white sheets. "Did I hurt you?" My voice was rough, cracking in the middle. She looked at me, her honey-brown eyes searching mine. Then slowly, she shook her head. No more than I could handle. It was a lie, meant to soothe me, and we both knew it. But the sheer bravery of it made my chest ache. My hand moved of its own volition, reaching out. This time, I didn't pull back. My fingers brushed against her cheek, feather-light. Her skin was ridiculously soft. She leaned into the touch. That small movement broke me. I let out a shuddering breath and leaned forward, resting my forehead against hers. I lost control, I murmured. The beast. It took everything. "You saved me," she whispered back. "You claimed me." "I marked you like cattle," I growled, self-hatred lacing my tone. "You marked me as yours," she corrected firmly. She moved her hand, covering mine her cheek. "And I am." The bond surged between us, warm and blindingly bright. She meant it. I pulled back just enough to look at her. The sheet had slipped down, revealing the angry bite mark on her shoulder. It was swollen, pulsing with heat. Pain. My pain. Inflicted on her. I leaned down, not with violence this time, but with a desperate need to atone. I pressed my lips softly to the unbroken skin, right beside the wound. She gasped, her fingers tightening on my hand. I murmured low in my throat, a soothing sound I hadn't known I was capable of making. I began to lick the wound, broad, gentle strokes of my tongue, meant to cool the inflammation, to soothe the ache. Her breath hitched, and I felt her body soften, melting against the pillows. The beast inside me settled, no longer pacing, content to simply be near her. But the man needed more. I needed to rewrite the memory of last night, I needed to show her that my hands could build as well as destroy. I moved over her, taking my weight on my forearms so I wouldn't crush her. I looked down into her eyes, letting her see everything. The guilt, the need, the overwhelming obsession. "Let me show you," I whispered against her lips. "Let me show you how it should have been." I kissed her. It wasn't a devouring claim this time. It was slow, deep, a worshipful exploration of her mouth. When we made love again, in the quiet light of the afternoon, it was a slow burn. I forced myself to be gentle, to rein in the immense power of my body. I paid homage to every inch of her, using my hands and mouth to draw soft sounds of pleasure from her instead of sharp cries of pain. I entered her slowly, watching her eyes flutter closed, feeling the bond hum with her pleasure instead of her shock. It was a different kind of intensity, deeper, quieter, binding us together not just in flesh, but in spirit. And afterwards, as I held her tucked against my side, her breathing evening out into sleep, I knew with terrifying certainty that the ruthless king was dead in this room. I was just a man, desperately in love with the woman he had been born to hate, and I would burn the entire world down to keep her safe.
The bond between us had become the baseline hum of my existence. It was a low, steady vibration in my chest that spiked hot when Atlas touched me and thrummed with a possessive low-grade anxiety whenever he left the room for more than 10 minutes. A week had passed since the claiming. A week spent mostly inside the sprawling ecosystem of our bed, exploring the terrifying, addictive landscape of this new connection. I had learned the geography of his scars, the specific rumble in his chest that meant he was amused, and the terrifying darkening of his golden eyes right before he lost control. I was no longer the fragile human guest. I was his mate. I carried his mark, a puckered, healing scar at the junction of my neck and shoulder that throbbed whenever he drew near. I belonged here. But while our private world was an intense, all-consuming bubble of heat and shared breath, the world outside our door was suffering. I stood by the towering window of our chambers, wrapped in a silk robe the colour of deep amber, watching the training yards below. The guards moved with rigid, terrified precision. Behind me, Atlas was strapping on his wrist guards. I felt the spike of his irritation through the bond before he even spoke. "Vain scouts are getting bolder in the southern ridges," he growled, more to himself than to me. "They're testing the perimeter like rats looking for a crack in the grain bin." I turned from the window. He was glorious, terrifying perfection in black leather and steel. The ruthless king, fully armoured again. But now, when I looked at him, I didn't just see the armour. I saw the man beneath it who had held me through the night, his large hand spread flat over my stomach as if to shield me from dreams. "You need your best strategist for the southern ridges," I said quietly. Atlas paused, his hand stilling on a buckle. The air in the room thickened instantly. He knew exactly who I meant. "The captains have their orders," he said, his tone clipping shut like a steel trap. I walked toward him. My bare feet made no sound on the thick rugs, but he tracked my every movement, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. I stopped right in front of him, placing a hand over the leather armour covering his chest. Beneath it, his heart gave a powerful, singular thud against my palm. "You banished Greg," I said. I didn't phrase it as a question. Atlas' jaw tightened. A flash of defensive anger sparked across the bond, hot and sharp. "Greg questioned my authority at a critical moment. He is lucky he was only confined to quarters." "He questioned your sanity when you were about to murder his son for handing me a glass of water," I corrected, keeping my voice calm, though my own heart was starting to race. Challenging him still felt like walking up to a sleeping dragon and kicking it. "He looked at you with pity," Atlas snarled, the golden eyes darkening fiercely. "No one looks at what is mine with pity." "It wasn't pity, Atlas. It was kindness. Something this palace is desperately short on because its king is too busy terrifying everyone to allow it." I pressed my hand harder against his chest. "Greg loves you. He's the closest thing to a father you've ever known, and you cast him aside because your pride couldn't handle being told you were wrong." He went very still. The energy radiating from him turned volatile, crackling against my skin. For a heartbeat, I thought the beast might surface, that I had pushed too far. But then, I felt it through the bond, a hairline fracture in his iron certainty, a flicker of doubt, a deep, buried ache of loneliness that he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He covered my hand with his own, his grip tight enough to be a warning. "You tread on dangerous ground, Stella," he rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. "Do not presume to tell an alpha how to command his pack." "I am not telling you how to command," I whispered, stepping closer until our bodies brushed. "I am telling you that a king who rules only through fear will eventually rule alone. You have me, you will always have me, but you need them too." He stared down at me, his internal war playing out in the tightening of the muscles around his eyes. He wanted to rage. He wanted to crush the dissent, but the bond tethered him to me, forcing him to feel my sincerity, my lack of fear. He let out a harsh, frustrated breath, dropping his forehead to rest against mine for a fleeting second. It was a massive concession. "Get dressed," he commanded gruffly, pulling away and striding toward the door. "If you are so desperate to see how I rule, you can come watch." The war room smelled of cold stone, old parchment, and high testosterone terror. When Atlas threw the double doors open, the dozen advisors and guard captains gathered around the massive strategic table flinched as one. Their eyes darted from Atlas to me, walking a step behind him, clad in a simple gown of deep green wool. My presence was a shock. The human mate, marked and claimed, entering the inner sanctum of war. And there, standing at the far end of the table, looking weary and older than I remembered, was Greg. He had been released from quarters for the meeting, but his stance was rigid, his eyes fixed on the map spread before him. He didn't look up as Atlas approached the head of the table. The chasm between the two men sucked the oxygen out of the room. Atlas didn't sit. He loomed over the table, placing his hands flat on the stone surface. "Report on the Varga Pass incursions," he demanded. The meeting began. It was brutal efficiency. Atlas tore apart strategic plans, barked orders that sent men scrambling, and outlined a counteroffensive against Vane's forces that was breathtaking in its violence. He was brilliant. He was terrifying, and he was completely ignoring his beta. I stood off to the side, near the hearth, watching. I could feel Atlas's tension through the bond, a coiled spring tight in his gut. He knew I was watching. He knew what I expected. Every time his eyes flicked towards Greg and then away, I felt a spike of stubborn pride. The meeting was winding down. Maps were being rolled up. The moment was slipping away. I sent a pulse down the bond. Not a thought, just a feeling. Courage. Atlas froze in the middle of dismissing a captain. His back went rigid. He didn't look at me, but I knew he'd felt it. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. The captains looked around nervously, wondering what fresh hell was about to descend. Atlas slowly turned his head to look down the length of the table. "Greg." His voice was low, lacking its usual thunder, but it commanded instant, absolute attention. Greg straightened, meeting his king's eyes for the first time. "Sire." Atlas seemed to be wrestling with his own tongue. I could feel the sheer physical effort it was taking him to bypass his alpha instincts, which screamed never to show weakness. The bond vibrated with his discomfort. "Your assessment regarding the incident in the corridor," Atlas ground out, each word sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "It was not entirely without merit." You could have heard a pin drop in the massive stone room. The other guard captains stared at the floor, terrified to witness the king admitting fault. Atlas's knuckles were white where they gripped the table edge. "The boy, Kaelin, he has returned to duty." "He has, Alpha," Greg replied, his voice carefully neutral, though I saw a flicker of profound surprise in his eyes. "Good," Atlas snapped, desperate to move past the moment. "See that he is assigned to the inner perimeter guard, and Greg..." He paused, his jaw working. "Your exile is ended. Resume your station at my right hand." It was stiff. It was graceless. It was barely an apology at all. But coming from Atlas, it was a miracle. Greg exhaled slowly, a tension leaving his shoulders that I hadn't realized he was carrying. He looked from Atlas to me, standing quietly by the fire. A look of profound understanding passed between us. He bowed his head deeply to Atlas. Thank you, Alpha. My life for yours. Yes, well, Atlas growled, turning away sharply to hide the slight flush rising on the back of his neck. See that it doesn't happen again. Dismissed, all of you. The room cleared with record speed. Men practically ran for the doors, eager to escape the intense atmosphere. When the last door boomed shut, Atlas and I were alone. He didn't turn to face me. He stood staring at the blank stone wall, radiating the petulant energy of a powerful man who had been forced to eat vegetables he hated. I walked over to him, sliding my arms around his waist from behind, pressing my cheek against the cool leather of his back armor. I felt the tension bleeding out of him, the slow, deep exhale that shuddered through his massive frame. He covered my hands linked at his waist with one of his own. You hated that, I murmured against his back. Every second of it, he grumbled. I'm proud of you. He spun around in my arms, his movements sudden and intense. His hands cupped my face, tilting my head back so his golden eyes could bore into mine. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the fiery, possessive heat that was always simmering just beneath the surface. Do not think, he said, his voice rough, that this means I am going soft, little bird. I am still the monster that the world fears. I know, I whispered, rising on my tiptoes to brush my lips against his. But you're my monster, and today you were a good king. He growled, a low, vibrating sound against my mouth, and kissed me fiercely, as if to prove that he was still dangerous. But the bond didn't lie. Underneath the fire and the pride, there was a profound sense of relief. He was whole again, his pack was restored, and I knew with a surge of triumphant warmth that I was the one who had mended it.
Peace was a pathetic, tedious business. 4 weeks. 4 weeks since I had claimed Stella, since I had broken the back of Seth's treason and dragged Greg back from the brink of exile. 4 weeks of relative quiet inside the stone walls of my territory. I sat on the obsidian throne, the jagged rock biting into my back through my leathers. Below me, 2 minor territory leaders were squabbling over water rights to a creek that barely flowed enough to water a goat. Before Stella, I would have ended this hour ago. I would have thrown one of them through the stained glass window and told the other the creek was now mine. It was efficient. It was terrifying. It worked. Now I had a conscience living inside my own head. The bond was a low, steady thrum in my chest, a golden thread connecting me to wherever she was in the castle. Right now, she was in the archives, probably civilizing the dust. I could feel her calm, her intellectual curiosity bubbling away. If I acted like the monster I wanted to be, that calm would shatter into disappointment. I would feel it instantly. And God's help me, the thought of her disappointment was more paralyzing than any army. Enough! I slammed my fist onto the armrest of the throne. The sound echoed like a cannon shot in the cavernous hall. The 2 men froze mid-shout, turning pale. The entire court held its breath. You will split the water access based on the seasonal flowcharts my archivists provide by midday tomorrow, I growled, my voice rolling over them like an avalanche. If I hear this creek mentioned in my presence again, I will dam it up with your corpses. Are we clear? They both bowed so fast they nearly cracked their skulls on the flagstones. Crystal clear, sire. Thank you for your wisdom, Alpha. They scrambled backwards out of the hall. Beside the throne, Greg cleared his throat. There was the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. A very measured response, Alpha. I shot him a glare that would wither an oak tree. Don't push it, old man. I hate this measured nonsense. It makes my skin itch. It makes the kingdom stable, Greg countered calmly. Her Majesty's influence is softening the edges of your reign, Atlas. The people are less afraid to breathe. I like them afraid to breathe. It keeps them honest. But Greg was right. The air in the palace had changed. The crushing weight of my perpetual rage had lifted. The curse was still there. A caged shadow in the back of my mind, scratching at the bars. But Stella was the lock on that cage. Her presence, her scent, the constant thrum of her soul against mine, kept the darkness at bay. But the effort of being measured was exhausting. The beast needed an outlet. The curse needed to be soothed. I needed her. The thought wasn't a gentle longing. It was a sudden, violent clawing in my gut. The itch under my skin flared into a burning need. 4 hours without seeing her face was 3 hours too long. I stood up abruptly. The court gasped again. "Greg, finish the docket. I have urgent business." I didn't wait for his acknowledgement. I stalked off the dais and out the side entrance, moving with a predator's urgency. I didn't go to the archives. I went to the small, sun-drenched solar overlooking the eastern gardens, her favorite spot to read in the afternoons. She was there, curled on a plush velvet window seat, a thick book resting on her knees. The sunlight caught the rich tones of her skin, making her glow like polished mahogany. She looked up as I slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, didn't widen in fear. They softened in welcome. "Meeting run long?" she asked, closing the book. "Intolerable," I growled, crossing the room in 3 long strides. I didn't bother with words. The need to touch her was overwhelming, a physical pain. I pulled her up from the window seat, crushing her body against the hard planes of my armor. Her scent, wildflowers, and something else now, something richer, deeper, like fertile earth after rain, filled my senses, drowning out the lingering smell of fearful politicians. I buried my face in her neck, right over the claiming mark. It was fully healed now, 4 silvery white scars against her beautiful dark skin. My brand. "Atlas," she breathed, her hands coming up to grip my shoulders. She wasn't protesting. She was grounding me. The bond flared hot between us, her answering desire meeting my desperation head on. "Need you," I muttered against her skin, my teeth grazing the sensitive spot just below her ear. "Now, Stella." I couldn't wait to get her back to our chambers. The beast wouldn't allow it. I lifted her onto the heavy oak table in the center of the room, sweeping a stack of scrolls onto the floor with a crash. I didn't care. I stepped between her legs, pushing her skirt up to her waist. She gasped as my hands found the bare skin of her thighs. I was rougher than I intended, my control frayed by hours of forced diplomacy. But she didn't shrink away. She wrapped her legs around my waist, pulling me closer, matching my intensity. "Show me," she whispered fiercely, her eyes locking onto mine. "Show me you're here." I tore at the fastenings of my leathers, freeing myself. I entered her in one swift, deep thrust, groaning as the tight, wet heat of her sheathed me. The relief was instantaneous. It was better than any drug, better than the bloodlust of battle. Being inside her silenced the scratching in my mind. It was the only place the curse couldn't reach me. Our coupling was fast, frantic. It wasn't about romance. It was about survival. It was about the terrifying, obsessive need to remind myself, physically and spiritually, that she was mine, that she hadn't run away from the monster. I gripped her hips, driving into her with a rhythm that made the heavy table shudder against the stone floor. Her head was thrown back, her neck exposed, sounds of broken pleasure escaping her lips. I felt her climax build through the bond, a tightening coil of golden light. It triggered my own. I buried my face in her shoulder, biting down gently on the muscle as I poured myself into her, shuddering violently. The bond roared, a deafening harmony of 2 souls fused together in the peak of sensation. Afterward, I didn't let her go. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of the table, pulling her into my lap, wrapping my arms around her so tightly it must have been uncomfortable. but she just nestled closer, resting her head on my chest, over my thundering heart. The room was quiet except for our ragged breathing. The sunbeam she had been sitting in moved across the floor. I ran a large hand up and down her spine, soothing the tremors that still ran through her body. She was already drifting off. She has been sleeping more lately. Deep, heavy sleeps in the middle of the day. I frowned, shifting slightly to look down at her peaceful face. There were faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a few weeks ago, and that scent, that new, rich undertone beneath the wildflowers, it was stronger now, clinging to her skin, even after we'd made love. I closed my eyes, focusing inward, tuning out the physical world and listening to the bond. It was quiet, calm, but deep in the center of her energy, low in her abdomen, there was a strange warmth. It wasn't the heat of arousal or the burn of pain. It was a steady, radiating glow, like a small ember buried deep in ash. It felt old and incredibly precious. The beast inside me, usually so restless, curled around that warmth in my mind's eye, huffing a protective breath over it. I didn't know what it was. A remnant of the claiming magic, a shift in her human physiology adjusting to the bond. Whatever it was hers, and therefore, it was mine to guard. I moved my hand from her back to her stomach, splaying my fingers wide over the soft curve of her belly, shielding the strange warmth from a world I still didn't trust. "Sleep, little bird," I rumbled softly, kissing the top of her head. "I've got you."
The fatigue was a physical weight, heavier than the velvet robes I wore to council meetings, heavier even than the golden collar of the Queen that rested against my collarbone. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a profound, marrow-deep exhaustion that seeped into my bones around midday and refused to leave. I had blamed it on the sheer emotional velocity of the last few weeks, the claiming, the treason, the frantic, all-consuming nature of Atlas's love. I sat to the right of the obsidian throne, fighting the urge to rest my head on the carved armrest. The council chamber was droning with the reports of grain merchants, a sound that usually interested me, but today felt like it was coming from underwater. Beside me, Atlas was a statue of brooding energy. But unlike his usual controlled menace, today he was twitchy. Through the bond, I felt a constant low-grade static of agitation. His leg bounced rhythmically under his heavy leather tunic. Every few minutes his head would snap toward me, his nostrils flaring wide, golden eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a complex equation written on my skin. He was smelling me, intensely. It was unnerving. Usually his scenting of me was possessive, a prelude to dragging me off to the nearest private surface. This felt different. It felt like a predator scenting something unfamiliar in its territory. And the northern quadrant reports a surplus of... The merchant droned on. Atlas suddenly stood up. The merchant choked on his words, terrified. "Out!" Atlas barked. His voice wasn't a roar, it was a tight, strained snap of sound. "Council is adjourned." Greg, standing by the dais, looked alarmed. "Sire, we have 3 more petitioners." "I said out!" The beast surfaced in his voice, a tectonic rumble that shook the dust motes in the shafts of sunlight. The room cleared in seconds. When the doors boomed shut, the silence was deafening. Atlas turned on me. He didn't stalk, he prowled. He closed the distance between us and gripped the arms of my chair, leaning over me until his face was inches from mine. He inhaled deeply, his chest shuddering with the effort. The golden fire in his eyes was chaotic, swirling with confusion and a rising panic that bled through the bond, making my own heart rate spike. "What is it?" I whispered, reaching up to touch his cheek. His skin was burning hot. He flinched, pulling back just an inch. "You smell different." "Different how? Did I use the wrong oil?" "No," he growled, frustration leaking into his tone. He leaned in again, inhaling near my neck, right over the mating mark. "It's beneath the surface, richer, sweeter, like..." He struggled for the words, like something is blooming in the dark. Fear spiked through me. The last time something bloomed inside me, it was the curse sickness that nearly killed me. "Atlas, am I sick again?" I asked, my voice trembling. The panic in his eyes solidified into terror. The bond screamed with it. Without a word, he scooped me up into his arms. He didn't carry me gently. He held me fiercely, defensively, as if an arrow were already flying toward me. He bolted from the council chamber, ignoring the startled guards in the hallway, and didn't stop until he'd kicked open the door to our chambers and deposited me on the center of the massive bed. "Stay," he commanded, his breath ragged. He turned to the door, shouting for the guards. "Get the healers! Now! Move!" He paced the foot of the bed like a caged animal while we waited. He wouldn't touch me, as if afraid his touch might accelerate whatever was happening. The distance, after weeks of suffocating closeness, felt cold and wrong. The healers arrived in a flurry of robes, an older woman named Prosy, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and 2 assistants. They smelled the tension in the room, the thick scent of an alpha on the verge of violence, and moved with cautious deference. "What seems to be the ailment, my queen?" Prosy asked gently, approaching the bed. "He says I smell different," I murmured, feeling foolish even as the exhaustion threatened to pull me under again. "And I'm tired. So tired." Atlas hovered behind Prosy, his shadow falling over the bed. "Find it!" he snarled at the healer. "Whatever it is that's changing her, find it and fix it." Prosy began her examination. She didn't use instruments at first. She used the senses of her kind. She leaned close, smelling the pulse point on my wrist, the curve of my neck. Her brow furrowed. Then she placed her hands flat on my lower abdomen, right over the silk of my gown. She closed her eyes, humming low in her throat, reaching out with her own subdued magic to read the energy within me. I felt a strange ripple beneath her palms. Not pain, just a tiny, fluttering warmth deep inside my womb. Prosy's eyes snapped open. The look on her face wasn't fear, it was an awning wonder. She slowly removed her hands and turned to face the pacing king. She dipped into a low, profound curtsy. "There is no sickness to fix, Alpha," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Don't play games with me," Atlas warned, taking a threatening step forward. "Why does she smell like that? Why is she exhausted?" "Because her body is doing the most sacred work," Prosy said softly, looking from him to me, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "The queen is with child." The world stopped. For me, the words were a sunrise. Shock, followed instantly by a wave of warmth so intense it brought tears to my eyes. A baby. Against all odds, against the backdrop of curses and war, we had created life. My hands flew to my stomach, covering the spot Prosy had touched. I looked up at Atlas, a smile trembling on my lips, ready to share the miracle through the bond. My smile died. Atlas wasn't looking at me. He was staring at my stomach as if it contained a viper. His face had drained of all colour, leaving him as violently as a man suffering mortal blood loss. The golden fire in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a hollow, abyssal blackness of absolute horror. The bond didn't just go cold. It snapped rigid with a revulsion so powerful it felt like a physical blow to my chest. "No," he whispered. It wasn't denial. It was a plea to the universe. "Atlas?" I reached out for him. He scrambled backward. The ruthless king, the man who faced down armies without blinking, physically recoiled from me. He backed away until he hit the heavy wardrobe, his chest heaving. "You're wrong," he choked out to the healer, never taking his horrified gaze off my midsection. "My senses do not lie, Alpha. The scent of new life is unmistakable. It is strong. It is healthy." "Healthy?" Atlas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was the most broken sound I had ever heard. "It's doomed." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the monster in his eyes, not the one that wanted to ravage the world, but the one that hated itself with a burning, poisonous passion. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice cracking into pieces. "I swore it would end with me. I swore I wouldn't pass this torture on." He saw the baby not as a gift, but as a vessel for his curse. He saw another life sentenced to the same endless, agonizing rage that defined his own existence. "Atlas, no, it's our baby," I pleaded, sliding off the bed to go to him. The protective instinct rose in me, fierce and sudden. "It's a miracle." "Stay back," he snarled, thrusting a hand out to stop me. The rejection was visceral. He couldn't be near me. He couldn't be near the threat he believed he had planted inside me. He looked around the room wildly, like an animal looking for an escape route from a trap. Then, without another word, without a backward glance, he turned and fled the chambers. The door slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot in the silence. I stood in the center of the room, my hands cradling the tiny, impossible heartbeat inside me, feeling the bond wither into a cold, dead silence at the other end. The silence in our chambers was louder than any scream. For weeks, the air between us had been thick with heat, scent, and the constant thrumming vibration of the bond. Now, it was sterile, dead. I lay in the center of the massive bed, excessively aware of the acres of cold silk surrounding me. Atlas hadn't just left the room, he had exiled himself. Greg, his face a mask of carefully neutral pity, had informed me that the king had taken up residence in his old quarters in the East Wing, the austere, barrack-like rooms he hadn't used since the night he claimed me. The bond wasn't broken. I knew what that felt like from the histories, a psychic amputation, but it was walled off. It felt like standing on one side of a frozen lake, seeing his silhouette through 10 feet of ice. I could feel his existence, a dull, distant ache of misery, but his emotions, his thoughts, the comforting rumble of his presence were gone. He was terrified of me, no, terrified of it, the tiny ember of life growing inside me. The first 2 days, I just wept. I lay curled on my side, my hands pressed over my flat stomach, mourning the loss of the man who had worshipped every inch of me only days before. By the 3rd day, the sorrow curdled into a thick, hot sludge of fury. How dare he? How dare he look at this miracle, this impossible, defying the odds life we had made, and see only his own darkness? I got out of bed. I bathed, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the lingering scent of his rejection. I dressed in a gown of deep crimson, a colour of war, and marched to the East Wing. The guards outside his door went pale when they saw me. They crossed their spears instantly. "My queen," one of them stammered, terrified. "The king has given strict orders, no disturbances." "I am not a disturbance," I said, my voice vibrating with an alpha tone I didn't know I possessed. "I am his mate. Move." They didn't move. They feared him more than they respected me. Before I could shout, the door yanked open from the inside. Atlas stood there. He looked wrecked. His golden eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles. His jaw was covered in 3 days of rough stubble. He wasn't wearing his armor, just breeches and a thin linen shirt that did nothing to hide the tension cording every muscle in his chest. He looked at me, and his eyes instantly dropped to my midsection. A spasm of raw panic crossed his face, and he physically took a step back into the shadows of his room. "Go away, Stella," he grated out. His voice was wrecked, like he hadn't spoken in days. "No." I stepped past the guards, pushing into the room. It smelled sterile, stone, cold ash, and the bitter tang of his own self-loathing. "We need to talk about this. You cannot just abandon me." "I haven't abandoned you," he snarled, backing away from me as if I were holding a loaded crossbow. He kept a large table between us. "I am protecting you." "By treating me like a leper? By looking at our child like it's a monster?" My hands flew to my stomach defensively. His gaze snapped to my hands and he flinched violently. "Don't call it that. It's not a child, Stella. It's a sentence. It's the curse finding a new host." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I won't be near it. I won't let my rage feed it. If I stay away, maybe it won't inherit the fire." His logic was twisted, born of lifelong trauma, but I heard the underlying agony. He truly believed his presence was poison. "You're wrong, Atlas," I said, my voice shaking with the force of my conviction. I could feel the baby, not physically yet, but spiritually, a tiny warm hum against my soul. It felt nothing like his rage, it felt like hope. This baby was made from love, from the bond. It is stronger than your curse." "You don't know that," he roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The wood splintered. "You don't know what lives inside me. I will not condemn an innocent soul to this hell." He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic plea. "Please, if you care for me at all, go, get it away from me." The walls slammed back down between us on the bond. The ice thickened. I looked at the man I loved, reduced to a terrified animal by his own past. I realized then that I couldn't save him from this fear. Not with words. I had to prove him wrong. I had to bring this baby into the world and show him it was light, not darkness. "I'm going," I whispered, stepping back toward the door. My heart felt like it was breaking all over again. "But you're making a mistake, Atlas, and one day you're going to regret every second you missed." I left him alone in his cold stone room, returning to the enormous empty bed that smelled faintly of wildflowers and fading memories. That night, the dreams changed. Before, my nightmares had been echoes of my past life, of loneliness and mundane fears. But this was different. I was standing in a vast, featureless plain of grey ash. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy and suffocating. It was freezing, a cold that bit through my skin and settled into my marrow. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence, ancient, vengeful. It felt like the opposite of the bond, a gaping maw of hunger and icy hatred. "So, the beast has bred." The voice didn't come from the air. It slithered directly into my mind. It sounded like dry leaves skittering on gravestones. It sounded like a woman's voice stripped of all warmth, leaving only malice. I tried to run through the ash, but my feet were heavy. The cold intensified, focusing on my center, focusing on my womb. "A true mating," the voice hissed, closer now. I felt a phantom breath on the back of my neck, smelling of decay, too bright, too strong. It must be snuffed out. Shadows began to coalesce around me, forming grasping tendrils that lashed out, trying to snare my ankles. I screamed, but the sound died in the thick, dead air. One of the shadows solidified into a hand, long, skeletal fingers tipped with jagged darkness. It lunged toward my stomach. My protective instinct flared hotter than the cold surrounding me. "No!" I screamed, throwing my hands over my belly, curling inward to shield the tiny spark of life. The shadowy hand struck my forearm instead. The pain was shocking, an icy burn that seared straight to the bone. It wasn't nightmare pain, it was real. I gasped, wrenching myself awake. I sat bolt upright in bed, drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The bedroom was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. It was just a dream. It had to be just a dream. But the room felt horribly cold, despite the fire dying in the hearth. The air felt thin, used up. My left forearm was throbbing with a dull, freezing ache. With trembling fingers, I pushed up the sleeve of my silk nightgown. There, stark against my dark skin in the moonlight, was a mark. It wasn't a normal bruise. It looked like frostbite in the shape of 3 long fingers, the skin puckered and greyish-blue, radiating a deep, unnatural chill. I stared at it, horror dawning on me. This wasn't Atlas's curse. This was something else, something outside of us. I instinctively reached for the bond, desperate for Atlas's strength, for his protection. The line was dead, frozen solid. I was alone in the big bed, cradling my freezing arm, realizing with dawning terror that whatever had just attacked me in the dark knew exactly what I carried, and it wanted it dead. I was fading. It wasn't morning sickness. It was a slow, deliberate siphoning of my soul. I felt like a vessel with a crack in the bottom, my vitality leaking out faster than I could replenish it with food or sleep. Days bled into nights in a grey fog of exhaustion. I was prisoner to the massive bed that still smelled faintly of Atlas, though he hadn't stepped foot in the room in weeks. Prosy, the healer, was frantic. Her potions turned to ash in my mouth. Her healing energy seemed to bounce off a cold, invisible barrier surrounding my skin. The bruise on my arm hadn't faded. It had spread, a spiderweb of frostbite tracing up toward my shoulder. And it wasn't alone. I woke up now with fresh marks, icy grips on my ankles, dark smudges on my ribs. The entity, the she-devil with the voice like dry leaves, was feeding on me to get to the baby. She was trying to starve it of light before it could even spark. I lay propped against a mountain of pillows, midday sun streaming feebly through the high windows. It offered no warmth. I kept my hands cupped over my stomach, a pathetic shield against an ancient evil. I whispered to the tiny life inside me, promising it protection I wasn't sure I could give, begging it to hold on. "Wither, little abomination," the voice hissed. It wasn't in a dream this time. It was right beside my ear. The sunlight in the room died instantly, replaced by a suffocating Arctic twilight. The air turned thick and gelid, tasting of rot. Panic, sharp and acidic, flooded my chest. "No," I whimpered, trying to push myself up, but my limbs felt like lead. The cold intensified, focusing into a spear point right over my womb. It wasn't a touch this time, it was an invasion. An icy hook sank into my core, grabbing hold of the fragile connection between me and the baby, and pulled. The pain was blinding, a searing, tearing agony that eclipsed anything I had ever felt. It felt like my very essence was being ripped apart. I couldn't stop it. I was too weak. The darkness was swallowing me, dragging me down into a freezing abyss, taking the baby with it. Terror, primal and absolute, ripped through me. I threw my head back and opened my mouth, and a sound tore from my throat that didn't belong to a civilized queen. It was the raw, guttural shriek of a dying animal calling for its mate. "Atlas!" The scream seemed to shatter the frozen air. A split second later, the world exploded. The bond, which had been a frozen wasteland for weeks, suddenly detonated with volcanic fury. It wasn't just emotion. It was a physical force slamming into my mind. The double doors to the royal chambers didn't just open. They splintered inward, wood screeching against stone as they were torn off their massive hinges. A blur of lethal, roaring motion tore into the room. Atlas. He was barely human. His clothes were half shredded by the partial shift that distorted his body. Muscles swollen to monstrous proportions, claws erupted from his hands, his eyes glowing like dual suns of pure, unadulterated rage. "Get away from her!" The roar shook the foundation of the palace. He crossed the room in a single bound, landing beside the bed. He was snarling, slashing wildly at the empty air, his chest heaving. He could smell the threat, feel the unnatural cold, but there was nothing physical for him to kill. The shadow entity laughed, a sound like cracking ice that echoed from everywhere at once. "The beast arrives too late," it hissed. The icy hook in my stomach twisted. I cried out again, curling into a ball of agony. The sound of my pain broke Atlas completely. The ferocious alpha collapsed onto the bed, covering my body with his own massive frame. He wasn't attacking anymore. He was shielding, trying to use his own searing heat to drive back the supernatural frost. "Stella, look at me," he demanded, his voice rough with panic, his hands framing my face. His golden eyes were wild with terror. "Stay with me. Fight it." "It's cold, Atlas," I whispered, my teeth chattering violently. "It's so cold." He roared again, a sound of pure impotence against an enemy he couldn't bleed. The room was freezing faster. The frost on the windows began to creep across the stone floor toward the bed. We were going to die here, frozen in our own sanctuary. Then the air shifted. It wasn't a return to normal temperature. It was something else entirely. A profound, vibrating hum filled the room, like the lowest note of a great organ. The crushing cold hit a wall of sudden, immense warmth. I gasped, the air rushing back into my lungs. Atlas went rigid above me, his head snapping up, looking toward the foot of the bed. Two spheres of light materialized there. They weren't blinding, but soft, radiant gold, pulsing with a gentle, powerful rhythm. They didn't have distinct human features, yet they felt incredibly, heartbreakingly familiar. They felt like safety. They felt like home. The shadow entity shrieked, a real sound this time, high and thin with fear, as the golden lights expanded. They stretched upward and outward, forming a shimmering, translucent dome of golden energy over our bed. The moment the dome closed, the cold vanished instantly. The oppressive presence evaporated like smoke in a strong wind. The silence that fell was absolute, save for the crackling of the hearth fire that had suddenly roared back to life. Atlas slowly lowered his head, looking at the lights with an expression I had never seen on him before. The monster melted away, leaving a man whose face was filled with shattered awe and a desperate, childlike longing. "Mother?" he whispered, the word barely more than a breath. "Father?" The golden lights pulsed once in response. A wave of pure, undiluted affection washed over us, a love so strong it felt like a physical caress. It was a proud love, a protective love. They hovered for a moment longer, ensuring the darkness was truly gone, and then, slowly, they faded back into the ether, leaving behind a lingering warmth in the air. We were alone. Atlas looked down at me. The golden fire in his eyes had dimmed to molten gold. He was trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His large hand moved from my face down to my stomach, resting there with a feather-light touch, as if afraid he might break me. The ice wall in the bond was gone. I could feel him again, a tidal wave of regret, relief, and an overwhelming, terrifying love. "You're safe," he choked out, dropping his forehead to rest against mine. Tears, hot and fast, dripped onto my cheeks. "I've got you. I'm here." Our bedchamber had become a golden cage. For 3 days following the attack, the shimmering dome of ancestral light had remained visible, a translucent shield pulsing with a low, comforting hum around our massive bed. Now it had faded to an invisible barrier, but I could still feel it. A warm tingle against my skin whenever I neared the edge of the mattress, a boundary line that said, safe. Inside that boundary, Atlas was a man possessed. The ice was gone, replaced by a volcanic intensity that was almost as overwhelming. He barely slept. He sat in a chair positioned between the bed and the door, his golden eyes tracking every shadow, his body coiled tight enough to snap steel. Through the fully reopened bond, I felt his constant, vibrating anxiety. It was a thick, sludgy current of protective rage and a terrifying inadequacy. He had failed to protect me from Seth. He had almost failed to protect me from the curse he thought he carried. Now, he was facing an enemy he couldn't tear apart with his claws, and it was driving him mad. I was recovering. The supernatural frostbite on my arms had faded to pale scars, and the bone-deep exhaustion was slowly receding, replaced by the unfamiliar, fluttering demands of pregnancy hunger. But while I grew stronger in our golden sanctuary, the world outside our doors was rotting. It started small, a twitch of a curtain where no one stood, a sudden drop in temperature in a hallway that should have been warm. Then came the whispers. Greg brought them to us, along with the daily reports he now delivered to our chambers, his usually stoic face drawn tight with worry. "The staff is unsettled, sire," Greg said, standing respectfully distant from the bed. He looked exhausted. "There are rumours. They say the shadows in the East Wing are moving against the wind. Maids are refusing to enter certain rooms alone." Atlas let out a low growl from his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. "Superstitious nonsense. Tell them if they don't do their jobs, I'll give them something real to fear." "It's not just fear, Atlas," I said quietly, sitting up against the pillows. I could feel the atmosphere of the palace pressing against the ancestral barrier. It felt thick, oily, and poisonous. "It's malice." We saw it that evening. A young servant girl, Betty, who had brought me tea every morning for the time I'd been here with a cheerful smile, entered with our dinner tray. As she approached the table where Atlas sat, her steps faltered. Her eyes, usually bright, were glazed and vacant. She didn't look at Atlas. She looked through him. "The beast feasts while the castle starves," she mumbled. Her voice was flat, monotone, not her own. Atlas went rigid. "What did you say?" Betty blinked, as if waking from a trance. The tray in her hands trembled violently, rattling the silverware. "Sire? I didn't say anything. I just brought the roast." Before she could set it down, her hands jerked spasmodically. The heavy silver tray flipped, sending hot gravy and porcelain crashing onto the stone floor inches from Atlas's boots. Betty gasped, horrified, dropping to her knees. "Oh God, sire, forgive me. I don't know what happened. My hands, they just—" "Get out," Atlas snarled, the sound so guttural that Betty scrambled backward on her hands and knees before fleeing the room. When the door slammed shut, Atlas exploded, He kicked the chair he'd been sitting in, sending it crashing against the far wall. He began to pace, a caged predator, raking his hands through his hair. "How do I fight this, Stella?" he roared, turning to me, his eyes wild with impotent fury. "If it were an army, I would meet them in the field. If it were an assassin, I would tear out his throat. But this poison in the air." He slammed his fist against the stone mantelpiece, cracking the masonry. "She's turning my own home against me. She's weaponizing fear." Through the bond, I felt his searing frustration. He was the ruthless king, the ultimate power in this kingdom, yet he was completely helpless against a whisper in the dark. "Your parents stopped her direct attack," I said, trying to keep my voice calm to soothe the raging storm inside him. "So now she's trying to weaken the foundations. If she can't break in, she'll try to get us to break out." The paranoia in the castle grew daily, a palpable fog that seeped under the doors. We could hear it in the way the guards outside our chamber muttered to each other, their tones sharp and suspicious. We could smell the bitter tang of their fear rising through the floorboards. They weren't afraid of the witch. They were afraid of Atlas. Hecate was twisting the narrative. The whispers said that Atlas had brought this darkness down upon them, that his refusal to succumb to his curse had offended the ancient powers, that the abomination I carried was drawing evil to the castle like a lodestone. The climax of the week came in the dead of night. I woke to the sound of shouting outside our door. Not the usual changing of the guard, but the chaotic yells of a struggle. Atlas was out of bed instantly, shifting halfway into his wolf form before his feet hit the floor, claws extending, canines lengthening. He threw open the chamber door. Greg was there, holding a young guard in a chokehold against the opposite wall. The guard was thrashing wildly, foaming at the mouth, his eyes rolled back in his head so only the whites showed. A dagger lay on the floor nearby. "He tried to bar the door from the outside, sire," Greg panted, struggling to contain the man's maniacal strength. "He was babbling about sealing the tomb." Atlas stalked forward, grabbing the possessed guard by the front of his tunic and slamming him against the stone so hard the man's head cracked against it. "Look at me," Atlas commanded, using the full weight of his alpha voice. The guard went limp, his eyes rolling back into focus. He looked up at his king with abject terror. "Sire, the lady in grey told me. She said you had to be kept in—" Atlas released him with a snarl of disgust. The guard slumped to the floor, weeping. Atlas stepped back into our room and slammed the door, throwing the heavy deadbolt. He leaned his forehead against the wood, his massive shoulders heaving. Through the bond, I felt a new sensation mix with his rage. Despair. "We are under siege, Stella," he whispered into the wood, his voice rough with the terrible realization. "Not from an army outside the walls, but from within." He turned to look at me, illuminated by the dying firelight. The golden dome of safety around our bed seemed suddenly very small, and the shadows in the corners of the room very deep. "She can't get in," he said flatly, "so she's going to make sure we can never get out."
The air in the palace didn't just turn sour. It died. I was awake, of course. I hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since I brought Stella back from the brink. I sat in the chair dragged close to the bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, listening to the double heartbeat that had become the entire rhythm of my existence. The golden hum of my parents' protection was a low vibration against my skin, a perimeter I dared not cross. But outside that holy circle, the darkness gathered. At 0300 hours, the ambient noise of the castle, the distant tread of patrols, the settling of ancient stone, ceased. It was replaced by a silence so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Then came the smell. Not the metallic tang of fear I'd grown used to over the last week. This was different. It smelled like old graves opened in the rain, and beneath it, the sickly, sweet, rotting floral scent of her. Hecate. My wolf surged to the surface, instantly snarling in my chest. I stood, my muscles coiling tight enough to snap bone. Through the bond, Stella stirred. Her fear spiked, a sharp needle in my mind. Atlas, what is it? Stay in the bed, I commanded, my voice already rough, dropping into the lower register of the shift. Do not move from the center. The handle of the heavy double doors began to turn slowly. The deadbolt I'd engaged hours ago groaned under immense, unnatural pressure. It wasn't an assassin trying to pick the lock. It was a siege. They belong to me now, little king. The voice didn't come from the hallway. It resonated in the stones of the wall, a collective whisper from a dozen throats on the other side of the oak. The doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. Wood splintered like kindling, blasting into the room. My roar met the breach. I didn't bother with a full shift. There wasn't room, and I needed my hands to carry her. I let the partial take over, my height swelling, claws erupting from my nail beds like steel daggers, my canines lengthening until I tasted my own blood. A wall of gray uniforms poured into the room. My royal guards, men I had trained, men whose children I knew. But their eyes were gone. In their place were pools of Vanta black, devoid of iris or sclera, weeping a thick, inky substance down their cheeks. They moved with jerky, synchronized spasms, like marionettes on tangled strings. "Kill the vessel," they chanted in unison. A cacophony of stolen voices layered over the witch's dry hiss. They charged the bed. I intercepted them at the edge of the golden barrier. The first guard, Miller, a good man with 10 years of service, lunged at me with his sword. He wasn't fighting with skill. He was fighting with suicidal abandon. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. My claws punched through his leather cuirass and into his chest cavity. I ripped outward. He didn't scream. He just kept clawing at me even as his heart stopped. I became a thresher. I was a whirlwind of fur, fang, and blood. I tore throats out with my teeth. I shattered spines with forearms thick with unnatural muscle. It was a slaughter, a desecration of my own house. But every time one of those black-eyed things got a step closer to Stella, a fresh wave of primal, volcanic terror detonated in my chest, fueling the carnage. Behind me, Stella was screaming my name, her terror flooding the bond, mixing with the baby's frantic distress. There were too many of them. They were climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, an endless gray tide driven by a singular, hateful will. A sword clipped my shoulder, slicing deep. Another jammed into my thigh. I barely felt it. The adrenaline and the roar of the bond drowned out everything but the need to protect. "Atlas down!" A familiar roar cut through the chaos. "Greg." I dropped to a crouch just as a silver blur hurtled over my head. Kalen. The beta had fully shifted, a massive gray wolf slamming into the wall of possessed guards with the force of a battering ram. He was snarling, snapping bones, a force of nature. Greg was right behind him, human, but wielding a broadsword with lethal precision, his face a grim mask of concentration as he hacked a path toward me. He was covered in blood that wasn't his own. "They're everywhere, sire," Greg bellowed over the din of snarling wolves and clashing steel. "The whole damn barracks turned. We have to move, now!" He was right. We couldn't hold the bedroom. Hecate would just keep throwing bodies at us until we drowned in them. "The bunker," I snarled, spitting out a mouthful of black-tasting blood. I turned to the bed. Stella was kneeling in the center, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. Her face dulled with horror as she looked at the shambles of our room. "I've got you," I promised, my voice a guttural rumble. I scooped her up into my arms, cradling her against my blood-soaked chest. She felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile against the violence radiating from me. "Hold on to me, Stella. Don't let go." "Never," she whispered fiercely, burying her face in my neck. "Kalen, point!" I roared. The gray wolf howled in acknowledgement and lunged for the doorway, clearing the path. Greg fell in behind me, guarding our backs. We ran. It was a nightmare descent to my own home, the wide corridors of the palace, usually brightly lit, and adorned with tapestries, were flickering with torchlight and slick with gore. Every shadow seemed to spawn more of them. Servants with meat cleavers, guards with pikes, even elderly advisors, their frail bodies pushed beyond human limits by the witch's possession, threw themselves at us. I didn't stop running. I used my shoulder as a battering ram, knocking aside anyone Kaelin missed. I felt hands grabbing at my clothes, at Stella's legs dangling from my arms. I snarled, kicking backward, shattering kneecaps. Stella never made a sound, just clung to me with a death grip. Her silent strength flowing into me through the bond, a lifeline in the madness. We reached the lower levels, the air growing colder, smelling of damp earth. The entrance to the ancient bunker, built by my great-grandfather during the Goblin Wars, loomed ahead. A massive circular door of iron and reinforced steel set into the bedrock of the castle foundation. Kaelin shifted back to human form, naked and panting, throwing his weight against the massive locking mechanism. "Greg, help me!" Greg slammed his shoulder against the wheel, groaning with effort. Slowly, agonizingly, the gears began to turn. The corridor behind us filled with the sound of pursuing feet. Dozens of them. "Faster!" I roared, spinning around, still holding Stella tight, putting my back to the slowly opening door. The horde rounded the corner. The sight of them, my people, corrupted into a mindless wave of hate, broke something inside me. "Take them, Hecate," I thought with cold fury. "Take them all, but you will not touch what is mine." The door groaned open just wide enough. "Inside! Go!" I shoved Greg and Kaelin through the gap. I backed in after them, filling the doorway with my bulk until the last second. As the first possessed guard lunged for the opening, I kicked him square in the chest, sending him flying back into the others. With a final heave, I slammed the iron door shut. I spun the locking wheel, engaging the 6 deadbolts that slid into the stone with the finality of a tomb. The sounds of scratching and pounding began instantly on the other side, muffled by feet of steel and stone. We were trapped, but we were alive. For now.
The sound of the 6th deadbolt slamming home was final. It was the sound of a coffin lid closing, heavy and absolute. The chaotic symphony of snarling wolves, clashing steel, and the mindless chanting roar of the possessed horde on the other side of the iron door ceased instantly. We were left in a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of 4 people and the drip of condensation on ancient stone. I was still plastered against Atlas's chest, my legs wrapped around his waist, his massive arms a steel cage beneath my thighs and back. He was vibrating, not with fear, but with a residual, murderous adrenaline that hummed through his body like a high-voltage wire. The bond between us was a deafening roar of static white noise, rage, violation, and a frantic, clawing need to ensure I was whole. "Atlas," I whispered, my voice cracking. The air down here was thick, cold, and smelled of damp earth and centuries of undisturbed dust. It bit at my lungs. He didn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened until it bordered on painful. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply, shuddering as he sought my scent over the copper tang of blood that coated him. "Safe," he ground out against my skin. The word was a growl, half formed by a mouth still thick with elongated canines. "You're safe. It's safe." He meant the baby. I pulled back just enough to cup his face. He was terrifying to behold. His golden eyes were blown wide, glowing with feral intensity in the dim light. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth, and his chest, bare where his tunic had been ripped away, was slick with gore that wasn't his own. Claws, sharp as obsidian daggers, still curved from his fingertips, digging slightly into my sides. "I'm here," I soothed, using the bond to push waves of calm toward the raging storm in his mind. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a teacup, but I pushed anyway. "We're all here. You got us out." Slowly, agonizingly, the tension began to leak out of him. The feral glow in his eyes dimmed to molten gold. The claws retracted with sickening wet clicks. He slumped against the cold iron door, sliding down until we were both sitting on the damp stone floor, though he refused to release me from his lap. Only then did I look around. We were in a circular antechamber, carved directly into the castle's bedrock foundations. The walls were rough-hewn granite that sweated cold moisture. The only light came from a patch of bioluminescent moss growing high on one wall, casting uncanny blue-green shadows, and a single sputtering torch Greg had managed to grab before we sealed the door. "Is everyone all right?" Greg's voice was steady, but beneath the surface I could feel his profound shake. He was leaning against the opposite wall, wiping his bloodied broadsword on his pant leg. Kaelin was crouched nearby, shivering violently. He had shifted back to human form just before we came through the door, and now he was naked in the freezing underground air, his body streaked with grime and bruises. "I'm fine," Kaelin chattered, wrapping his arms around himself. "Just cold." Atlas let out a low rumble. He finally shifted me off his lap, though he kept a possessive hand on my ankle as he stood. He strode over to a heavy wooden chest pushed against the far wall, tearing the lid open with a snap of rusted hinges. He pulled out musty wool cloaks, stiff with age but thick. He tossed one to Kaelin and brought another back to me, wrapping it around my shoulders before pulling me back against his side. "This place," Greg murmured, holding the torch high to inspect the space. "The old texts mention it, the Founder's Vault, supposed to be impenetrable." "It is," Atlas said, his voice flat, void of any emotion now, save cold calculation. He ran a hand over the massive locking mechanism of the door. "The Dwarven Kings forged this iron. Not even Hecate can blast through it." "So we're safe," Kaelin said, huddled in his cloak, his voice sounding small in the echoing space. "No," Atlas corrected, turning from the door to face us. The shadows clung to his massive frame, making him look like an ancient warlord carved from the rock itself. "We're trapped." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a devastating mixture of fury and guilt. "She turned my own house against me," he whispered, the realization a physical blow. "Miller, old Nan in the kitchens, she hollowed them out and wore them like skin." I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his blood-stained ones. The horror of what we had just witnessed, faces I knew, eyes I recognized, devoid of humanity and filled only with a witch's hate, threatened to overwhelm me. But I couldn't break. Not now. "They aren't dead, Atlas," I said fiercely, squeezing his hand. "She's possessing them. We can save them." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the exhaustion beneath the rage. "How, Stella? We can't even open this door without 1,000 of them tearing us apart." He gestured around the cold, tomb-like space. "This wasn't built for comfort. It was built for a last stand. There's water from an underground spring in the next chamber, and maybe enough dried rations to last a week, if the rats haven't gotten to them." A week. Buried alive in the dark, while above us, an ancient evil wore the faces of our friends and ruled our home. I placed my other hand over my belly. The baby fluttered again, a tiny resilient spark in the encroaching darkness. "Then we have a week," I said, meeting his gaze with all the strength the queens of old granted me. "A week to figure out how to take back our kingdom without killing our people." Atlas stared at me for a long beat. Then slowly, he nodded. He pulled me tight against his side, his body a furnace against the underground chill. "A week," he agreed, his voice dropping to a lethal promise. "And then I'm going to tear that witch's soul apart." We didn't have a week. We didn't even have the night. The pounding on the iron door was ceaseless. It wasn't a rhythmic knocking. It was a chaotic, frantic avalanche of blows. Fists, generated by hysterical strength, slamming against the metal until I thought my own skull would fracture from the noise. They were scratching, clawing, throwing their bodies against the barrier with a mindless devotion to their dark mistress. Inside the vault, the air grew stale and freezing. Greg paced the small perimeter, his sword drawn, eyes fixed on the door's hinges. Kaelin, wrapped in the wool cloak, sat shivering against the wall, his wolf whining just beneath his skin, hypersensitive to the unnatural army outside. Atlas didn't move from my side. He sat on the cold stone floor, his back against the wall, pulling me between his legs so my back rested against his broad chest. His arms were locked around me, a human shield against a threat that could walk through walls. Through our bond, I felt his turbulent ocean of rage and terrified impotence. He wanted to tear down the door and slaughter everyone outside to make the noise stop, to stop them frightening me, but he knew that opening that door meant death. "Focus on me," he rumbled into my hair, his voice a low vibration meant to drown out the madness outside. "Just my heartbeat, Stella. Nothing else matters." I tried. I closed my eyes and listened to the powerful, steady thrum of his heart beneath my ear. But the psychic weight of Hecate's malice was seeping through the stone like freezing water. Then the pain hit. It wasn't the dull ache of exhaustion I'd felt for weeks. This was a sharp, twisting knife low in my belly that stole my breath. I gasped, my body jerking violently against Atlas's hold. His grip tightened instantly, his claws emerging slightly to snag on my dress. "Stella, what is it? Is it the witch?" Another spasm ripped through me, harder this time, accompanied by a terrifying gush of warm fluid between my legs that soaked my skirt and the cloak I sat on. "Oh God," I whispered, panic clawing at my throat. I clutched at his forearms. "Atlas, the water, it broke." His entire body went rigid. For a heartbeat, the ruthless king, the monster who feared nothing, stopped breathing. "It's too soon," he snarled, not at me, but at the universe, at the curse. "It's weeks too soon." "She's doing this," I gasped as another contraction seized me, far too close to the first one. This wasn't normal labor. It was being forced, accelerated by the dark pressure in the room. "Hecate, she's trying to force the baby out." "Greg! Kaelin!" Atlas roared, shifting me so I was lying across his lap, his eyes wild in the torchlight. "Get over here, now!" They scrambled to us. Greg dropped to his knees, his face pale beneath the grime. "Sire, what do you need?" "Blankets, water, anything to make her comfortable," Atlas barked, his hands trembling slightly as he smoothed the hair back from my sweating forehead. "She's in labor." The words hung heavy in the cold air, heavier even than the iron door. Birth in this tomb, while an army of possessed souls screamed outside. The contractions came furiously, waves of agony that blurred the edges of my vision. There was no time to breathe between them, no time to prepare. I gripped Atlas's hand so hard I felt his bones grind together, but he never flinched. He just poured his strength into me through the bond, a river of raw, desperate power. "You've got her, Stella," he encouraged, his voice thick with emotion I'd never heard before. "You are the strongest creature I have ever known. Breathe for me." But the air in the room was changing. The torchlight sputtered, turning a sickly shade of green. The cold intensified, biting past the wool cloaks, settling deep in my bones. The noise outside the door suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. "Do you think stone can keep me out, little vessel?" The voice wasn't in my head this time. It was in the room. A shadow detached itself from the far corner of the vault. It wasn't a natural shadow. It was a concentrated absence of light, a swirling vortex of ancient hatred that smelled of rot. It began to coalesce at the foot of our makeshift bed, forming a vague, towering female outline with burning green coals for eyes. Hecate. Atlas let out a roar that shook dust from the low ceiling. He lunged, placing his body between me and the spirit, his claws slashing uselessly at the smoke. "You will not touch her!" he bellowed, his alpha command echoing impotently against a being that had no physical form to obey. "The pact is written in blood," the spirit hissed, her voice like grinding stones. The shadow loomed over Atlas's shoulder, staring directly at my distended belly. "That child is mine to break. It can't live." "No!" I screamed, another contraction nearly folding me in half. The pressure was immense, undeniable. The baby was coming. Now. "Push, Stella!" Greg yelled, terrified but trying to help, having thrown a blanket over my lower half. I pushed. I pushed with everything I had left, fueled by terror and a mother's primal need to protect. Hecate shrieked, a sound that shattered the glass pane of the single empty lantern in the corner. The shadow dove toward me, ignoring Atlas's thrashing attempts to stop her. She was going to snuff out the life the moment it emerged. Mine, she screeched. Atlas, I screamed, feeling the baby crown tearing me apart. He was there, his hands replacing Greg's, ready to catch our child even as he snarled at the encroaching darkness. With one final agonizing push that felt like dying, the pressure released. Silence fell inside the vault for one heartbeat. Then a cry tore through the stagnant air. It wasn't a weak, premature mewl. It was a strong, furious wail of life announcing its arrival in the dark. Atlas held the tiny, blood-slicked bundle in his massive, clawed hands. He looked down, his golden eyes wide, his chest heaving. Hecate's shadow form recoiled violently, as if struck by a physical blow. "No!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with sudden, hateful agony. Atlas looked from the baby to the writhing spirit, bewilderment warring with his protective instincts. "What is it?" I gasped, trying to sit up, reaching for my child. "Is he okay?" Atlas looked at me, and the expression on his face broke my heart. It was a look of utter, shattering disbelief. Tears, hot and fast, spilled from his golden eyes, tracking through the blood on his cheeks. "Stella," he choked out, his voice barely audible. He looked back down at the crying infant, seemingly unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "It's a girl." The words hit the air like a physical force. Hecate's spirit writhed, her form becoming unstable, flickering in and out of existence. No, the curse. It has to continue. The curse was specific. It plagued the male line. It demanded the suffering of the firstborn son to perpetuate itself. My daughter let out another cry, louder this time, and as she did, something incredible happened. A light began to emanate from her tiny body. It wasn't torchlight or moonlight. It was a pure, blinding, incandescent radiance, the golden light of Atlas's parents, but brighter, untainted by centuries of pain. The light exploded outward from the baby, filling the dank vault with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. Hecate screamed, a true scream of mortal terror this time, as the light hit her. The shadow dissipated instantly, burned away like fog under a high noon sun. There was a psychic backlash, a whip-crack sound that popped my ears, and then she was gone. The light faded to a soft, warm glow around our daughter's skin. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. The pounding outside the door had ceased the second the light appeared. The psychic weight in the air vanished, leaving it crisp and clean. I looked at Atlas. He was kneeling on the stone floor, holding our daughter against his chest as if she were made of spun glass. His eyes met mine over her tiny head. The gold in them was no longer burning with rage or tormented by ancient pain. They were just clear. He took a shuddering breath, then another, deeper than any I'd ever seen him take. His shoulders slumped, the perpetual tension that defined his existence evaporating. "It's gone," he whispered, the realization dawning in his voice like the sunrise. He looked down at the tiny, miraculous creature in his arms, awe replacing the terror. "The pain. Stella, it's just gone." 4 months and 3 days later, the palace finally felt like a home instead of a fortress holding its breath. The scent of rot and old blood was gone, replaced by the dizzying aroma of jasmine blooming on the balcony and the soft, powdery smell of new life that permeated the royal nursery. Sunlight, real, unfiltered sunlight that didn't seem to carry shadows anymore, streamed through the tall arched windows, pooling on the plush cream rugs. I sat in the window seat, my body finally feeling like my own again after the ordeal of the bunker and the long recovery that followed. The bond hummed between Atlas and me, no longer a frantic, deafening roar of shared terror, but a deep, resonant river of unwavering devotion. It was quieter now, settled, but no less intense. I watched him. The ruthless king, the alpha whose snarl could drop seasoned warriors to their knees, was sitting in an overstuffed rocking chair that looked ridiculously small beneath his massive frame. He was shirtless, the morning sun gilding the impressive expanse of his shoulders and back. The perpetual tension that used to bunch the muscles around his neck, as if he were constantly bracing for an unseen blow, was gone. In his arms, cradled against the dark ink of the tribal tattoos covering his chest, was our daughter. She was so small. Even at 4 months old, she looked like a porcelain doll against his raw size. He held her with a terrified, gentle awe, his movements exaggeratedly slow. His large hand, tipped with nails that could lengthen into lethal claws in a heartbeat, ghosted over her wispy dark curly hair, terrified of pressing too hard. He was humming something low in his chest, a vibration I felt through the floorboards. When she stirred, blinking open eyes that were already turning the molten gold of her father's, his entire face transformed. The hard lines around his mouth softened. The intense, predatory glint in his eyes melted into pure, unadulterated wonder. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that showed his teeth not in a snarl, but in joy. It was a look I hadn't seen until the moment the curse broke in that freezing vault. It was the look of a man who had been drowning his entire life, finally realizing he could breathe. He looked up, sensing my gaze, the bond tugging my affection toward him. His golden eyes were clear, untroubled by the ancient agony that used to haunt them. "She likes the sun," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that no longer carried the edge of a growl. "She turns toward it already." I smiled, sliding off the window seat to walk toward them. "She is the sun, Atlas." She brought the light back. I stopped next to the chair, resting my hand on his shoulder. The skin was warm, solid, and relaxed beneath my touch. I looked down at our daughter, who was currently blowing a spit bubble at her terrifying father. "We haven't named her yet," I said softly. "Not officially. The council is getting restless for an announcement." Atlas's expression shuttered slightly. The council, the kingdom, the outside world that we were slowly rebuilding after Hecate's devastation. But here, in this room, none of that mattered. "Let them wait," he grumbled, shifting the baby higher on his chest. "They can wait 1,000 years for all I care." I chuckled, threading my fingers through the hair at the nape of his neck. The possessiveness was still there, fierce and absolute, but it was no longer driven by the fear of loss. It was driven by the joy of having. "Atlas," I said, my voice quiet in the peaceful room. I thought back to that horrible night in their bedroom, before the siege, when the golden light of his parents had first shielded me. I thought of the blinding radiance that had burst from our daughter in the bunker, banishing the darkness forever. "You never told me her name," I whispered. "Your mother." He went still. The humming stopped. He stared down at the baby in his arms, his jaw working slightly. He hadn't spoken of his parents in decades, not since the curse had taken them and left him alone in the torment. "Why do you ask?" His voice was rough, thick with old ghosts that no longer had teeth. "Because they saved us," I said firmly. "That night in our room, when Hecate first attacked me really hard, they came. Their light protected me. And when she arrived," I touched the baby's soft cheek, "she carried that same light. She carries their legacy, Atlas, not the curse, the protection." Atlas let out a shuddering breath. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against my stomach as I stood behind him. "Lyra," he whispered into the silence. The name sounded foreign on his tongue, unused and sacred. "Her name was Lyra." I looked down at the beautiful little girl, the curse-breaker, the bringer of dawn. "Lyra," I repeated, testing the sound. It felt right. It felt like light and music. "Our little Lyra?" Atlas opened his eyes, looking up at me with an intensity that stole my breath. The gratitude in his gaze was overwhelming, a physical weight in the room. Carefully, with the same terrified reverence, he stood up and walked over to the ornate wooden crib, settling the drowsy baby down. He watched her for a moment, making sure she was perfect, before turning his full attention to me. He closed the distance between us in one long stride, wrapping his massive arms around my waist and pulling me flush against him. I buried my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of him. Sun, alpha musk, and peace. "You saved me, Stella," he murmured against the neat rows of dark braids I just made a few weeks ago, his voice shaking slightly. He wasn't talking about the bunker. He was talking about his soul. "Every day of my miserable existence was agony until you." He pulled back just enough to cut my face in his large, warm hands, tilting my head back. His golden eyes searched mine, cementing the bond that tied us together for eternity. "My queen," he whispered, before lowering his head to claim my mouth in a deep, slow kiss that tasted of promises kept and a future that was finally, blessedly bright. The kiss quickly turned hungry, as if we hadn't touched each other in weeks, though it had only been hours. Atlas's hands slid down my back, pulling me flush against him, and I could feel the hard evidence of his desire pressing into my stomach. I whimpered into his mouth, already craving more. He broke the kiss only to lift me into his arms, carrying me the few steps to the small daybed we kept in the nursery for late-night feedings. Gently he laid me down, his eyes dark with need. "Wait," he growled, turning to the crib where Lyra slept peacefully. He rotated it just enough so that the ornate side panel blocked any view of the bed. "We don't want to corrupt her innocence," he said with a wicked grin. I laughed softly, already pulling my dress over my head. "She's 4 months old, Atlas. I doubt she'll remember." He turned back to me, his gaze raking over my now bare body. "Still," he murmured, stalking toward me like the predator he was. "I'd rather not take any chances." I reached for his belt, my fingers fumbling with the buckle. "Then let's be quick and quiet." He covered my hands with his, stilling them. "Of course, my queen," he said, his voice rough. He stepped back to shed his pants, but before he could even push them down his hips, a tiny wail pierced the air. We both froze. Lyra's cries grew louder, insistent and demanding. Atlas closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. He glanced down at the very obvious bulge straining against his pants, then toward the crib where our daughter was making her displeasure known. I couldn't help it. I burst into laughter. "Maybe she doesn't want a sibling yet," I teased, sitting up and pulling my dress back on. "She might have seen it coming." Atlas groaned, but a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "I suppose we'll have to try again later," he said, leaning down to press a lingering kiss to my forehead. "After all, we have a lifetime." He straightened and went to pick up Lyra, cradling her against his chest with that same awe that never failed to melt my heart. As I watched them, I knew that this, the laughter, the love, the occasional interruptions, was exactly the future he and I always dreamed of. And it was just the beginning of that future.
When your heart feels like it's fading and your faith begins to drown, when the world keeps taking and there's no strength left to be found, I know the taste of losing. I've walked that road alone, but if you reach for me tonight, I'll guide you home. Let me be the one who saves you when the dark won't let you sleep. Let me carry all your sorrows when they cut too deep. I don't need a crown or glory, I just need your heart be close. Let me be the one who saves you when you've got nowhere to go. I see the scars you try to hide, the pain behind your eyes. You say you're fine, but I can tell you're breaking inside. I trade the breath inside my chest to see you smile again. If love's a war, I'll fight the rest until the